So I'll be talking about a topic that I'm really passionate about, which is using art as a tool to communicate science. My name is Dr. Beata Mierzwa, and I'm a postdoc at UCSD in San Diego. In the lab, I study how human cells divide with the aim to improve the way we treat cancer. Along my academic career path, I also create science art and fashion to communicate science. And I'm also passionate about science outreach, so I love using video games, and student workshops, and art to share the beauty of biology with the world and get creative students excited about science. I had no idea that combining science and art could be such a fantastic tool for science communication. So I'd love to tell you a little bit about how I discovered that I could combine my passions, which was during my PhD in Austria. I was born in Poland in a very small village. You can see it was in the middle of nowhere. There were no scientists around, but I did grow up with a little bit of both worlds because my dad is an engineer and my mom an artist. So I had a very analytical and also very visual approach. And I really liked both of them. But when I was younger, it never even crossed my mind that science and art could be combined. It seemed like completely different disciplines for me. So in school, I used to love, creating drawings for my friends, but I never thought about art as my main career path for myself. I didn't really know much about science either. I didn't have any scientists in the family. I didn't know what a lab looked like from the inside or how research works. I was really fascinated and intrigued by the concept of how we are made of cells and how DNA is our genetic material, and all of these fascinating things that somehow are able to make life possible. Because I thought I had to choose between my two passions, I decided to start by studying molecular biology. And I didn't know what to expect, but during my undergrad, I started doing a lot of microscopy. So I was using these huge microscopes that can take pictures of these tiny cells, and I fell in love with the beauty of science. So I was using these microscopes. The image, what you can see here on the left, is a picture of cells that are dividing. I still remember the moment when I saw my first dividing cell. It was during one of my early internships, and I was immediately fascinated by the beauty of this process. So you see all of these gorgeous structures here, and what you can see here is basically a human cell going through division. You might recognize some of these structures here if you are familiar with looking at microscopy images, but if not, I'm happy to walk you through. So in purple, you can see the DNA. This is our genetic material that makes us who we are. And in green is a structure called the microtubules. These are important to pull the chromosomes apart during cell division so that each cell can receive the correct set of DNA. And that is very important that this doesn't go wrong because it can lead to cancer if there's a problem with that. What I found really fascinating is that even though this is really pretty and beautiful, there's so much more to these structures than what we can see under the microscope. So what you see here is a drawing that I added to highlight all of the structures that are too small to capture with a microscope. So you have the DNA with the helix here and the DNA bases. You have the microtubules that are made of these tubes, of these subunits, and then you have the membrane that wraps around the DNA to create the nuclear envelope and structures like this. So I was so fascinated by the beauty and about how much we still don't understand about cell division, and I've been studying this process ever since. After doing my PhD in Austria, I moved to San Diego for my postdoc, and now I still study how different types of cells divide and kind of trying to find ways how we can improve the way we treat cancer. And what I really love about working in the lab is that I get to use my creativity to design experiments and think outside the box. So when I first started, I had no idea that there are so many parallels between kind of coming up with creative ideas for art and also coming up with creative ideas for experiments. I love having the chance to see something under the microscope that no one has ever seen before and kind of solve questions that have been kind of fascinating humanity for a long time. So that was about my research, just a brief introduction, but my journey towards combining science and art was much less straightforward. Maybe like me, many of you grew up hearing that science and art have very little in common, and then either you can be a scientist or an artist. But historically speaking, art and science were never completely separate. Drawings were really crucial to record and to communicate scientific observations, and therefore scientists really had to be artists as well. And so here are some examples. One example is Leonardo da Vinci. He really brilliantly combined kind of art and science and engineering, and all of these skills that he developed as an artist enabled him to draw these really detailed representations about anatomy and biology and his inventions. Another great example is Ernst Haeckel. So he illustrated Darwin's ideas on evolution and on natural selection. And these drawings were really crucial to make his work and his ideas that were completely new at that time known to the public. So it was a very important part of the discovery and of the communication process. And finally, here are some really amazing drawings by Walter Fleming. And he actually drew what he saw under the microscope. So, at that time, there were no cameras, no computers. So the drawings were super important to share his findings. And it's actually amazingly accurate. Even today, when I look at his pictures, I can totally see cell division and how it's still being drawn today. All of these people were both scientists and artists, and their work really made a huge impact through the science, art, and communication. Nowadays, what about nowadays? We have computers and cameras. So what are the benefits of science art right now? In my own experience, discovering this combination between science and art has had two major impacts in my own work. So the first one is how I think about and communicate my own research. For example, making illustrations has allowed me to practice a skill that I think is extremely important in science in general, which is to take a complex manuscript or a set of data and experiments and portray the essence of the story in a clear and concise way. Often it's very difficult to kind of decide what's the most important aspect that you want to communicate without overwhelming other people with all of the other details that are also interesting, but sometimes maybe too much to communicate in one go. Another thing was illustrating other people's research was really helpful because often this research was from different scientific fields. It actually helped me gain new ideas for my own research. So often the starting point is a manuscript. And so the first step in my creative process is to read the paper, read some of the background literature, and get familiar with the field. And this had led me to really discover new literature and actually gave me some ideas for experiments for my own research. And also, from the perspective of if you're in science actively, promoting your research in artistic ways can help, get grants, get funding, and encourage creative scientists to join your lab. The second big impact for me was how I interact with people outside the scientific community. As you all know, communicating science can really increase the impact of our discoveries. And we can show the world that, what we scientists are doing is not only fascinating, but also really beneficial to our world. And this has become incredibly important, especially these days. It's also a great way to give non-scientists a chance to appreciate the beauty and wonder of biology. And most importantly to me is also, it has the potential to spark fascination and curiosity and can really inspire our next generation of scientists, which is incredibly important as well. When I started creating art, I had none of this in mind, and I would have never thought that discovering my passion for art could turn out to be so helpful in so many ways. I want to go a little bit into more detail about both of these aspects and why I basically will tell you a little bit about how I found my way into making science art and how that process worked for me. Okay, so let's start with communicating research inside the scientific community. So, like I said, when I was younger, I loved art and science, but never crossed my mind that I could combine them because I didn't have really any role models at that time doing this. I wasn't sure what to study after high school. I thought I had to pick, so I decided to study molecular biology, and I thought I can always do some art on the side at home and things like that. I thought it's easier to learn art by myself than to learn science by myself. But the truth is, what happened is, I started studying and I started fully focusing on my lab work, and I never had a chance to make time for creative projects. I think that happens a lot to a lot of people in many different contexts. So this went on for about 7 years or so. But then a few years into my PhD, I had a chance to create my own first science drawing. So this was my very first science drawing. And you can see here 2 cells, and they are both connected with a bridge. And they are literally using a pair of scissors to cut each other apart. So I thought it might be kind of a fun way to introduce my research question. And I started using it on the title slide of my presentation. So when I was going to conferences or presenting at my institute, I noticed that people would remember my research even years after I presented it. And that's because they remember the drawing. They remember how unconventional it was. But together with the drawing, they also remember the research. And this is the first time I realized that science art could be such an amazing and powerful tool to communicate my research, both inside and also outside the scientific community. This inspired me to continue experimenting. I started playing with more creative ways to present my findings as they were kind of emerging during my PhD. So what you see on this slide is the same drawing, but this time it's overlaid with real microscopy images. So in blue, you can see the DNA. That's the nuclei that contain our genetic information. And in magenta, you can see the microtubules. So this is kind of like a network that goes throughout the entire cell that is important for a lot of different functions. As I was experimenting with all of these experiences made me realize that even if something is getting more and more complicated, like it always happens in science, there's always a way to make things more intuitive by using metaphors and connecting it with something that we are familiar with from everyday life. And so this inspired me to continue making drawings and experimenting. So while I was kind of playing around with this, other people started asking me to make drawings for their research as well. First, it was the people from my lab, then people from my institute who were working in different labs and different fields, and then also people who I didn't have a previous connection with. So I started drawing every night after coming home from the lab, or drawing on the weekends, and ended up making illustrations for papers, for journal covers, for conferences, research space missions. So there were a lot of really fun and unexpected adventures that came from this that I would have never dreamt that would happen one day when I started science. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this video, you might like one of the similar videos above, or one of the other science, art, legislative, entertainment, and humanist videos from HFFC's YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe to our channel by clicking the subscribe button above.